This is Chapter 9, Section 3, Organized Labor in the United States. As we're going through today's information, I would recommend that you take notes, so you'll have that information for your test later, and then also for the check for understanding at the end of this unit. The first thing we're going to talk about today in this unit, or in this section rather, is the labor movement. And so I know that for us it is very hard to imagine life prior to where we are right now, or even the 20th century. But back, 200 years ago, people did not have a 5-day work week. There was no vacations, no sick leave, no even basic amenities that would help employees. So early on in the 1800s, there started to become some labor unions because it was the Industrial Revolution, and so there was a huge shift towards factories. There were very few regulations and rules for employees. Age limits and minimums did not really exist. Children could work in factories. The elderly would have to work basically until they died. People were injured constantly on the job. There were very few job securities, and working conditions and wages were not very good. So they started to kind of rally together and create different types of what they called federations at the time to try to gain some of those rights as workers. So they started striking, and unfortunately many of these strikes were very violent. People were often killed or were severely injured during these strikes, and so they really did not go very well for either side. One of the very first unions was the Knights of Labor, and it became nationwide and adopted political goals, including an 8-hour workday for all workers and the end of child labor. Its membership grew quickly, especially for the union, after the union helped workers win concessions from the big railroad companies in the 1880s. So this is Samuel Gompers, and he was one of the leaders of the American Federation of Labor, and you can see him there. But employers really resisted this. They really were not okay with this joint action being put together by their employees. And so they would do things to try to gain back power. They would lobby Congress to try to encourage them to not pass these laws for labor restrictions and things like that. But Congress really did start having to act. And so during the Great Depression of the 1930s, we definitely see some serious issues really being magnified, and things like no unemployment, these very difficult conditions people were living in, and union membership in the United States declined as millions of people lost their jobs. Unions gained power through laws passed as part of the New Deal, a series of reforms that attempted to revive the country's economy. So a couple of these congressional acts were the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which outlawed the practice of hiring only workers who agreed not to join a union. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, known also as the Wagner Act, protected the rights of workers in the private sector to form unions, and to use strikes and other job actions. And then the third one that we're going to talk about is the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which set a minimum wage. So we still really focus a lot on that minimum wage, and it's still a hot topic debated today. So during this period, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, also known as the CIO, organized unions for industrial workers, originally part of the AFL, which we just mentioned before, which favored skilled workers and craft unions. The CIO broke away in 1938. So they had broken away. They later on came back together in 1955. And then later on, there was a development of the United Auto Workers Union as well. So we can see multiple unions and some unions working together. So there is some backlash against unions following World War II. The end of World War II ushered in a period of anti-union legislation. In 1947, over the veto of President Harry S. Truman, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed and amended the Wagner Act and limited union activities, increasing the government's power to intervene if a strike might threaten national security. So here they're putting down strikes if they believe that it could hurt the nation's security. Americans' fear of communism also played a role. The political and economic system of the Soviet Union led to further restrictions on unions. There's the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959, which forbade communists from holding union offices and required tighter financial and electoral accounting. And so a lot of unions kind of got this reputation as a result, and many people assumed that they were run by communists. And there was a loss of traditional strongholds. So there was a decrease in blue-collar jobs, more foreign competition, increase in women in the workforce, and relocation of businesses. This right-to-work laws, these make it illegal to require workers to join unions. So when someone is hired, they do not have to join a union. They can be employed without being a member of that union. The unions had developed the closed shop. A business required to hire only union members. And so this right to work law kind of helped to forbid employers from having to look at union membership. Okay, so let's now talk about union negotiating methods. We're going to talk first about collective bargaining, which is usually what we see when talking about unions. Collective bargaining is the way businesses and unions negotiate wages and working conditions. So usually you'll have your businesses, the business owners, sit down with the leaders of these unions or the leaders of the workers, and they will work together to negotiate what works best for not only the employer, but also the employees. Since it represents many employees together, a union can arrive at a better deal for workers than if each employee gained or bargained with the employer separately. So the idea is that the union works together, the members of the union work together to gain the same benefits as a whole rather than separately. In the 1930s and 1940s, unions negotiated for higher wages, better working conditions, and fair grievance procedures for workers who felt that they had been treated unjustly. As these demands were increasingly met, unions negotiated for job security and such fringe benefits as health insurance. Benefits and job security are important issues in today's negotiations as well. And we can definitely see this in our political atmosphere that we're currently living in. Unions have the threat of a strike to provide a motivation for management to come to terms, but strikes occur much less frequently than in the past. So there has been a decrease in union membership and union activism in recent years. Large-scale work stoppages in the United States occurred hundreds of times a year before the 1980s, but dropped to about 20 per year by the 2000s. And part of this, like I said, is because of a decline in union membership. The vast majority of union contracts are settled without such action. However, some negotiations require additional interventions if the two sides cannot agree. So usually a mediator may be brought in to try to negotiate with both sides. But if that does not work, the dispute may be settled by binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is the decision by a neutral third party that each side agrees ahead of time to accept. So for industries related to public safety, the government might issue an injunction to force workers back to work after a stoppage, or to stop protest activities that may interfere with public safety. So again, kind of using those things as a way to get what they want. And arbitration is legally binding. So because they both agree on who the third party is, they both have to be okay with the outcome.